All right. All right, guys. So we're going to talk about congressional debate, and I'm just going to kind of go through this presentation. It will seem at times like I am giving a student presentation, but the reason is that if you're going to be able to successfully coach students, then there are things that you need to know that the students need to know. So I'm kind of approaching it from that point of view, and hopefully this is kind of what you were looking for is, what is the best way to prepare your students for this event. Congressional debate is a really exciting event because it does things that the other events don't. So I've always said that every event is about argumentation, and congressional debate is no different. But the one thing that congressional debate does that the others do not is it teaches students to work with people that maybe aren't from their same area or maybe don't have the same views that they have. And I think that requirement of learning to collaborate with people that you may not have initially known is so valuable for the future for these kids to go into their careers and into college and that kind of thing. So I think it's a great event, and I'm really glad that UIL adopted it and that it is really blooming. It's becoming much bigger. So the first thing about having a successful congressional debate round is having good legislation to debate about. So that's kind of the first thing that I want to talk about. The legislation, so you've got the bills and you've got the resolutions, and then you've even got constitutional amendments that you can send in. Some important things to think about: correct grammatical structure and style. That's because you don't want to have to clean it up in round. And while that can be done, it is much better to present it correct so that it reads correctly, and that also helps to keep kids in the right context of the legislation. So it's really important to double check that and make sure that it is grammatically correct and stylistically correct. It needs to contain a very clear purpose. So when you're thinking about the different legislation that you and your students might write to send in, really think about the intent. What are you trying to get at? Because if you can really start with a very strong statement of purpose, it helps you to develop that legislation in a more direct way. And just like anything else, if you can use more direct language, you get better results. So it needs to solve or address a current issue. So I have seen legislation that comes out that is not about anything current. I think it's just been recycled from several years back. And then you go in and realize that either been done or that this isn't really an issue anymore. So it really needs to be about something current, because you want students to be able to research using current research. And as you know, especially over the last few months, I mean, it is hard to think even what we were doing back in January, and that was the beginning of this year. And so the times are changing so fast, and we don't want kids to get in the habit of providing research that is a year or even 6 months old anymore. We want stuff that is really relevant to today. And even though the legislation isn't going to be immediate, as far as they'll be debating this for a while, that's even more of a reason to make sure that when you write it, it is super relevant and super recent. So you need to, as you're kind of thinking about what kind of legislation to submit or how to formulate the legislation, think about what exactly is needed, and then if what you think is needed is feasible, and have your students really research what is already done and what real Congress is trying to accomplish regarding whatever this thing is. You also want to try to look at doing things that are not overdone and have some uniqueness to them. So I really encourage that old ideas not be recycled too much because we want to keep kids on top of right now. We don't want them to continue to talk about should the penny be, abolished or whatever. And that's, yes, it's still relevant, but it's kind of an old idea, and a lot of people are just kind of tired of arguing about it. So just try to think of things that are fresh. That really is helpful, and it does excite the kids when they can talk about stuff that they haven't talked about over and over and over again. All right. So it's important to learn the terminology because your students will need to know the terminology. So what is a PO? What is a parliamentarian? Senator, representative. What are all of the what are all the motions? You just the terminology that is used is important because without knowing it, or at least having a pretty good idea about it, the students will get lost in the round and may not know exactly what's going on. So another thing that I highly encourage is have them watch rounds online. And if hopefully you can be with them, but even if you have to do it through Zoom, watch those rounds and stop at certain points and kind of analyze what's been said. So what did the speaker say? What did the questioners say? If you can get to an NSDA like speech or presentation on the congressional debate round, what is the person that's analyzing it saying, and why is that important to know? So teach them the importance of 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 being memorable, and that a lot of that comes from analyzing what the other students did. I also encourage, if you're watching a round, look at how the results ended up, and then keep that to yourself, and then at the end of the round have them rank how they would have ranked, and then justify why they ranked that way. Because if you can get them to think in terms of what the judges are thinking, that is going to be so valuable for them, because they'll realize, this is what I need to do to be noticed. This is what these other kids did to get noticed. And even if someone is a very good speaker, they may not be memorable, and they're not asking questions. They're not involved in the round. So it's important to watch rounds and get kids to think about what the judges are looking for, because it's a 3-hour round. So every speech is not going to linger in the head of a judge. It's more about, overall, how did that kid stand out? So it's important for them to really analyze that. Be observant. The best way to teach students how to be successful is to notice the trends of the students who are successful. So I encourage you to not only send them into round, but for you to also go and watch and analyze, even if you aren't judging. Although if you want to go watch a round, I almost guarantee you will be able to judge, unless you have kids in every room, because it is hard to find Congress judges. But be observant in those rounds and just really think about, what are the really successful students doing? And, just like, that's how I basically learned to coach, was watching students compete. I didn't come from a background of speech and debate. So I learned everything that I learned from watching people and just kind of analyzing what was going on. And, it works out okay to do it that way. So I strongly encourage you to do that. And then lastly, watch finals. I know a lot of people like to leave if their students are no longer competing, but I kind of had a policy with my kids that was, if you're not in finals, you need to go find out why. Why are you not in the final? What did you not do that these other kids did, so that next time you can be in the final? I kind of think about, life is about learning, and it's not a failure if you learn something from it. So go learn something from it and don't let it happen again. That's what I used to tell them. Go learn why you're not in the final and don't let it happen again. So, but it was all in fun. It's, obviously you want them to do well, but if they don't, you love them anyway. All right. Ensure that the students know the rules. So there, whether you're doing UIL, TFA, NSDA, each of the different types of competitions have a little variance on the rules. And I always had mine to keep a copy of the rules, because if there is a question, it looks good for them to know the answer. It looks good for them to say, I have I have the rule book right here. This is what it says. So that even, because sometimes even the parliamentarian may not be as familiar with the rules as we would hope that they would be, because they're just like, again, there are so many, and a lot of the people that are involved in all of the different types of competitions, and they may not remember kind of the nuances of each rule book. So I encourage you to get them to read the rules, know the rules, and keep a copy of the rules. The other thing is teach them parliamentary procedure by practicing in class. So I would have them rotate who is PO so that they can get that practice in. And then we did practices in class at least 3 days a week. And then we also did after school practice twice a week. So I would give them, a list of 5 or 6 pieces of legislation to have prepared. And then I graded them on, did you give a speech? How good was that speech? Did you ask questions? How good were those questions? And that was one way that I helped them prepare, was by making it, something that they've done over and over again, because the more you do it, the better you get. So do those practices in class and even after school. I gave all of my students, or had them, to make sure that they had with them the table of frequently used motions, because everybody has brain farts and you might not remember what you need to say, but if you have that with you, it's a pretty easy way to look and see. So precedence, they need to know what precedence is, and if they are going to be the PO, they really need to know how to keep precedence. And if there is direct questioning, they have to have precedence with that direct questioning. That's part of the rule of it. So make sure they know that. Also make sure that they have a good understanding about gavel signals. Some POs do it differently than others, but they need to have their own gaveling procedure in case they can be PO. And I know that there is a lot of discussion about, should your student be the PO, because sometimes the PO doesn't get ranked when they should. UIL in particular is really good about making sure judges understand the role of a PO, and I think it happens much less often in UIL that POs are not ranked. But the thing is, without a good PO, the round is not going to happen. And if you have a student who is particularly successful, and it's not a real high stakes thing, or if it's UIL, because like I said, UIL does a very good job at all of the competitions saying, okay, be sure that you consider the PO, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't happen everywhere. But have them know their own gavel signals and practice those. And that's one of the reasons that I would have them rotate who was PO in their class rounds. So if you have a small team and you can't really do a full round of Congress practice because you don't have enough students to do that, coordinate with others. Coordinate with other schools, or even with, if you have students in one of your classes that needs some kind of extra credit, let them come in and do that as like part of a grade. So, it's a great alternative grade, because they're speaking, they're writing, they're, critical thinking. All of those things are in play. So just, you can be creative, but it is really important to give kids that opportunity. All right. Whether it is STEMP or Congress or debate, one of my big things is evidence standards. Please, please, really kind of put the hammer down on your kids about presenting false evidence. And I'll tell you why. And I'm not saying that my kids never presented false evidence, but I found out a couple of times, and when I did, the punishment was severe. They didn't get to compete for months. I would pull them from final rounds. I mean, I've done things that are pretty harsh because I wanted them to understand this is not something I take lightly. And there is a reason. They can do impromptu if they don't want to give real evidence. They don't have to do extemp or Congress or debate. But if they are going to do an event that is based around evidence, they need to provide honest evidence. And there are judges, and I am one of them, who, if I don't think that what they're telling me is accurate, I will check it. And if I find out that a student has given false information in their speech, if they have said that something is a quote or is evidence and it is not what they said, I will thank them for it. So just to let you know, that is super important. The other thing that you need to tell them, and this is what I always told mine, is we are a team. So when one person messes up, it looks bad on all of us. And I had this thing that I did that was a little different in that they had their, handbook that was like an inch thick or whatever, 2 inches thick. But then they had 5 rules. And rule number 1 is don't embarrass me in public. And that covers not lying. That covers don't do stupid stuff that I have to be called in because you did something stupid. And we recited that every day. What are the 5 rules? So that was the first one. And um, when I talked about it on, maybe about once every 2 months, I would say, if you do something that embarrasses me, you are in big trouble because I don't need that. I have got too much stress in my life. I don't need you stressing me out more. So it was all, we had fun with it, but they knew that I was serious about it. So the other thing is plagiarism. Really encourage your kids to have their own arguments and their own, not to use other people's AGDs and not to use other people's words as their own. Even if it's a spoken word, it is still plagiarism if they didn't come up with it. So just, kind of teach them about that and help them to understand that plagiarism is not just when you write a paper, it's also when you give a speech. And then integrity. You can be very successful as far as winning a bunch of awards, but it doesn't matter if it comes out later that it was all, you know, um, underhanded. You need to teach your kids integrity. They need to know that you can look yourself in the mirror in 5 years and be very proud of who you are, regardless of what awards you have. The award that you have of being proud of yourself and standing by what you think is important and your values is far bigger than any trophy. Those trophies everybody is going to forget about. But who you are, that doesn't get forgotten very easily. So, I think it is really important for coaches to teach that to their students. All right. So one other thing that is really necessary in Congress, as much as, if not more than, well, probably debate in Congress, which is congressional debate, that's why, you have to respond to what other people say. It does not need to be a situation where everybody has their speeches and everybody gives their speeches, but none of the speeches interact. And what I think about when that happens is I used to, when my grandmother was still alive, I would go see her in the nursing home. And I used to just get so tickled because they would be sitting there, some of these elderly people would be sitting there talking, and it seemed like they were having a conversation, but they were talking about 2 very different things. And I used to just think that was so funny. But sometimes I feel that way in debate rounds and in congressional debate rounds. It's like, are y'all even talking about the same stuff? Because I am completely lost about how these 2 things interact. So get them in the habit of listening and flowing the round so that when they get up to give their speeches, they can be interactive. Have them listen for flaws in logic and listen for evidence holes. So what are the problems with what is being said? Where is there a break in the link chain? And that's where they can expose holes in other people's logic so that that's what makes them stand out. Oh, this person, yeah, when I was listening to that, I didn't understand either. And here this kid is saying, hey, I didn't understand that. Here's why. And they've explained what I needed to know. And now that's who I remember, because they're able to point out those holes in logic and they're able to fix the problem. All right. So when you get the legislation, and hopefully it's all really great, it's really relevant, and it's really easy to prepare. Maybe not easy, but at least you can find stuff. Analyze the legislation. So read it very carefully. I always did like a week before school started, we did a summer thing, and we would kind of go through some of the legislation and kind of analyze it so that we were prepared. Now that was for TFA because we had that legislation then. But whenever you get legislation for something new, whether it's a tournament that does its own legislation, or whether it's UIL, or whether it's TFA or NSDA or whatever it is, take the time to have those kids come in and really talk about each piece of legislation, or as much as possible. Who is going to enforce this bill? That's something that you need to know. And is that person the best person to do it? Does the legislation reach its goal? So you should be able to read it and say, okay, what are they trying to accomplish? And then do they accomplish that in the way this is? And if not, that's areas that you can really utilize as you're getting your kids to prepare, arguments. Read topic literature. So I love when kids read books about the topic areas, because they can use those books for so many different things. And books stay relevant far longer than articles do. So I always would go to half price books and just buy a bunch of books that are, not super old, but that are, and so they're still relevant. They need to be probably within the last 5 to 7 years, depending on the topic. But give them those books and have them do little book studies on the books. Have them, if you don't have enough for more than one person, then have them write like a book review where they read the book and then they have to talk about different aspects of the book. When they're doing their research, have them watch YouTube videos, listen to podcasts, read think tanks and journals, news articles, especially if it is a news article that is not from just like a short daily, New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, those are okay, but they don't really contain a ton of analysis. So it's much better if it's from something like, Business Insider or something along those lines. So I really encourage them to read articles and books and journals that have some in-depth analysis. They need to read from various perspectives. And I think in the world we live in right now, it is so important for students to understand that people can have different points of view. That is okay. And sometimes it doesn't seem like it is, but it is. In fact, I think that we're doing ourselves and our country an injustice if we become a product of groupthink. So it's really important. They don't have to agree with both sides, but have them read both sides and be aware of what the other arguments are. It will make their own arguments better. Also have them, I'd already said this and now I said it again. Oh well. Look up PDF when they do their search terms on the internet. Have them put in the search term and then PDF. And a lot of times that will give them reports and that kind of stuff that they can use to put together, the ideas for their arguments. If they don't understand a concept, I am not opposed to them reading Wikipedia to learn about the concept. I will tell you this, I've always heard Wikipedia was a little shady. The other day I was reading something and it was about a piece of legislation that passed in like 2017. And I don't remember what I was reading about. But anyway, it talked about what had happened in like 2014 and 2015 and 2016. And then it said, and in 2017, Barack Obama signed this into legislation. And I was like, nope, that didn't happen because he was not president. So I said, I thought, well, I just need to let Wikipedia know so they can make the change. So I read how to go in and get a change made in Wikipedia, and it said just click on the edit this page and edit it. You don't have to sign in or anything. Anybody can get in there and change something, and that's crazy. I never knew that was true, but now I'm a believer because I changed a page on Wikipedia and no one knows that I did it. So that's pretty interesting. But to get an overview, I think Wikipedia is fine. Also, one of the good things about Wikipedia is if you go where the references are, a lot of times there's some really good articles that you can go to use as research in the reference section. So there's also that. One other thing that they do in Congress that I think is beneficial, but sometimes kind of goes unappreciated, and sometimes that doesn't happen when it should, is they need to look at the laws that conflict with whatever the bill is, or even the laws that may conflict with a resolution. Look at what the current legislation says. Like in America, what are the laws? and really focus on if something refers back to a different legislation from the past, that it's reversing or something along those lines. You need to go back and read the old stuff so that you can make comparisons and talk about what needed to happen and what didn't. So for example, if there was, and this isn't student Congress, but in Congress, the USMCA, one of the things that is different about it is that it deals with, data trade. And that wasn't a thing when NAFTA was written. So having something in there that addresses digital trade and, I can't think of what the word is, but when ideas that have been stolen, what is the thing? It's mostly with China. Somebody can chime in and tell me if you want to, but I can't think of it. But anyway, whatever it is, that is addressed in the USMCA. Clearly that wasn't addressed in NAFTA because it wasn't a thing yet. So looking at the old legislation to see what is needed is good. All right. And then look at constitutional constraints. So one of the areas that people sometimes don't think about when they are writing their legislation is we're not talking about state Congress or local Congress. We're talking about national. So the legislation that's presented needs to be something that the federal government has jurisdiction of. So if it's about something related to teacher pay, that's not federal. If it is something that is related to driver's licenses, for the most part, that's not federal either. So make sure that they're writing about things that are federal and not things that are state or local. And if when you're researching you find that this is not something that a federal legislation would really be, would not be the way to handle the situation, then make notes about that. All right. When you've read everything, you've done your reading and all that kind of stuff, then have the students brainstorm arguments. And then go through the arguments and brainstorm responses to the arguments. And then balance. So kind of balance, the affirmative and the negative arguments, pro and con. Like what are good pro arguments and what are good con arguments. You will find that often there is legislation that nobody wants to give a con speech about, or nobody wants to give a pro speech about. Well, if your student is prepared to do that, that gives them an opportunity to get another speech. And hopefully the legislation has two sides. Usually you can find something that makes for a good argument on the other side. I know that sometimes the concern is political correctness. Teach them how to make arguments that may not on the surface seem politically correct. teach them to make those arguments in a way that is politically correct. So you may have to play with the language a little bit and even play with the direction that you're coming from, and even look a little deeper for kind of what the reasoning is behind the other side, because there is always two sides. People don't all think the same, and find out what that is and find ways to approach it that are not offensive. Teachers, students to impromptu speeches related to the topic. A lot of times I would have them come in. I didn't feel like doing a whole lot of stuff because debate was at the end of the day, and I was kind of tired of talking, especially when I started to lose my voice. I would say, okay, well, today we're doing impromptu speeches. And I would give them a topic from the legislation, and they had to present, they had 7 minutes. You could use it any way you want. You can either, plan for 2 and speak for 5, or however you want to do it, but give a speech about this topic. And that really helped them to learn to kind of put forth arguments on the fly, because they kind of have to be able to do that. And it helped them to stay focused on what the topics were. Another thing that I always did with my students, and this was Congress and extemp, is sit down and spend a day just, here's a topic area, let's come up with intros. Let's come up with AGDs. Let's come up with a way to contextualize. So I think that that's a portion of the speeches that is often not focused on when teaching, but it's such an important part of the speech. That's what gets the attention of the judge and the audience. So it's important that you are able to come up with stuff. And you don't want to spend, like if it's extemp, you don't want to spend all your prep time trying to come up with an AGD. So if you've been able to brainstorm those in class, it really helps to kind of get those creative juices flowing and have them ready whenever they get these different topics. Outlining in notes. They should learn to outline what they want to speak about. I don't think it is a good idea to have them write an entire speech out word for word, because you don't want them to get up in the front of the room and have their eyes glued to their paper the whole time. They lose ethos that way. They need to have it where they have bullet points or just a regular outline, and so that they know the structure of the speech, and then they can just talk about it. And that requires that they have some knowledge about the topic as well. So really try to get them out of the habit of writing every word of a speech. Now, I say that, but when they're first learning, a lot of times you have them do that, and then you have them read it in front of the camera, and then I have them transcribe what they wrote, and then I have them go in and revise it for better word economy and get rid of all of the words that they didn't need, and the filler words and the filler phrases, and treat it like a paper and make it perfect. Doing that, while it may not be a speech they ever give in the Congress room, it does get them in the habit of being able to use good word economy and recognizing when they are using filler words. So that's an exercise that I think is helpful, and I think you would also find it helpful. I talked about practice rounds. Another thing is keep files, just like extemp, keep files. So we did Google Drive, and we just had a file folder for each piece of legislation. And then within each file folder, we had a pro and a con. And then we would put articles in there that related to different ideas that we had talked about as arguments. So it really helps them to have something that they can use if needed, especially if they're trying to come up with a speech because nobody else is doing one. Having said that, I don't think it's a good idea to have them prepare their speeches in round as a general principle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, have them practice extemp. Congress is 3-minute extemp. That's all it really is. Now, yes, they're having to interact with other arguments, but it is essentially they're having to get up and talk for 3 minutes about a topic they've already kind of had a chance to research. So in some ways, it should be easier than extemp. If they're giving a speech on like an authorship or sponsorship speech, I don't even know that they really need a flow pad. They don't really need anything to refer to. They should be able to get up and give a 3-minute speech without referring to something on paper. They do it for extemp. And I think it's much more compelling when they're able to look at their judges and look at the other representatives and say, here's what needs to be done and here's why it needs to be done. And not to have to look at the flow pad. It just adds a lot of credibility to the kid. So that's just something to think about. So in their outlines, they need to put the item number and a description of what the legislation is, and then have them write down some of the nuances of the legislation so that they don't forget when they're in round, and then have them come up with a list of arguments with a few little subpoints for each one, and then also like on the, so do that on the left, and then on the right, put responses to those arguments, because they either will be using those arguments to get their own speeches, or they will be responding to those arguments when they give their own speeches. So it's really good to have both sides of that on their flow or on their outline. And we always just did ours. Some of them did it on like on a computer and had just, you know, a list of that stuff, but some of them did it on their flow pads for their prep. So they need to have the point, the evidence, and the example, and then questions and answers. And then I would have them take a different, of course, a different colored pen, and as people were giving speeches, write down what your question would be, or write down what your response would be, and write down who is saying it, because again, as you're responding, you need to have that information, and that's part of the listening. All right. In round, students should have a precedence chart with them. They should have a copy of the legislation with them. They should have a charged computer with them. They should have outlines and legal pads with them. These are things that they need when they go in round. They need to have pens. Girls need to wear hose with their skirts. It looks much cleaner and more professional, and it helps their skirt really to stay down, and especially the skirts that are above the knees, you know, that you don't want those riding up, and so wearing hose really helps with that. Also, just kind of on the side note, teach girls to sit in skirts. That's something that a lot of people don't teach anymore, and sometimes it can be pretty distracting. So just, I encourage you to teach girls to sit with their ankles crossed. Have a table of motions and have Robert's Rules of Order or some kind of rules with them. It doesn't have to be the Robert's Rules. It can be just the rules of the competition. But the precedence chart, I always have them keep several, because if they are going to PO, they need it. And even if they aren't going to PO, when they get into finals rounds, it's a good idea for all of them to keep precedence. That can really help keep the PO honest. Okay, as they're giving their speeches, let's talk about their AGD. I do not like it when I hear them give a 30-second AGD. You should not be spending 10% of your time giving an AGD. That AGD should be 5 to 10 seconds, 5 to 10, maybe 15 at the most. It should be pretty short. Remember that the goal that they should have is for them to help me as a judge, or whoever their judge is, to forget that they are in high school. So don't get up there and tell me about your little brother or your, you know, the cartoons that you like to watch, or whatever. Try to do something that is professional and makes you seem like an expert in the area. So you're supposed to be a congressperson, and you can't get into Congress when you're 15 years old or 16 or 18 even. So I need to forget your age and think of you in terms of, this is a professional who could be serving in Congress. Have them contextualize their argument if necessary, especially if they're talking about something different than what other people have talked about, or if they're giving the first speech. Why are we having this conversation? What is it that makes this necessary? So I guess in some terms, if you think about inherency, what is the inherency in this argument? Why are we having this conversation? How is it significant? And what is the problem that it's trying to solve, and why now? Why is it a different situation now than it was 5 years ago? So have them contextualize. I think that's really helpful in round. Make sure they're well informed. They need to have read that previous legislation that we're either abolishing or that we're adding to, or even if it's something that we're not abolishing, we're not adding to, but there is legislation that exists that is related to what we're talking about right now. Have them to be well informed on that. That is something that judges notice. Have them to have a basic understanding of the Constitution, because then they can have those arguments about why this legislation would pass a Supreme Court challenge or why it wouldn't. And those might be things that could come up in round, and they need to be aware of how that argument would function. If they're not the first speaker, need to provide clash. So I think it's important for them to understand that if someone else has already said that, there's no need for you to go up there and say it again, unless you have some nuance to your argument, or unless you can expand on something that was very underdeveloped before. You really need to have something fresh. I'm sure you have probably judged rounds or heard rounds where that doesn't happen, and you essentially feel like you're hearing the same speech over and over and over. So really teach them what clash is and how to have clash in their speeches, to kind of reference other arguments and be able to talk about those other arguments and how their argument interacts with that argument. Teach them to create a link chain. So when you are trying to convince someone of something, what you want to do is kind of put together a story as to why doing whatever you're wanting them to do is good or bad. So teach them how to make those arguments in a way that they are covering every part of that link and they're not leaving out big chunks of it. Teach them to back up their claims with evidence and empirical examples and descriptions, anything that's going to paint a picture in the head of the judge or the audience. That's always a much easier thing for someone to digest than these really complex arguments that it's hard to understand because there's not really any kind of description or example. And if you don't know about whatever they're arguing, then you're even more lost. So those kids that are able to kind of give a concrete example that helps the judge kind of picture in their head what is being said, those are the kids that tend to do better. So details are really good. Cite credible sources. I know they research, but sometimes they forget to tell me where they got their research. And showing me that they have done their homework not only gives credibility to their argument, but it gives credibility to them. So the argument is credible because they've gotten information that supports it, but they become more credible because I know that they've done their homework, and that helps them to stand out. Humanize impacts. So instead of, this is good for businesses, this is good for the people who start these small businesses, this is good for the people this is good for the people that I am here representing. This is good for, they needed to do it in terms of the people that are impacted and not the things, because humanizing the impact makes it more meaningful to the people listening, because we're all people and we can understand that. Those mirror neurons get turned on and start thinking in terms of yeah, how would I feel if I were in that position? And then crystallization speeches. So there's a rebuttal speech, and everything after the first speech should be a rebuttal of some kind. But toward the end of the cycle, it's really good if you have a student who is very well versed in how to crystallize a round. So what that means is they've taken all of their notes. They've kind of kept up with what everyone else is saying. And then when they give that crystallization speech, they talk about, here's what so-and-so said, and here's why we need to reconsider that point of view, or here's what was said by these three uh, representatives, and here's why that is a good thing that we need to really carry forward. So really, it's just kind of crystallizing, is putting it all into a neat little package that kind of sums up everything that's happened and tries to draw some kind of conclusion out of it. So have them work on those. That's a higher skill set, but it's really good in round to have someone who's able to do that, and judges do remember that. That's another reason why some of those more seasoned Congress students will wait and give their speeches toward the end of the cycle, because they can give a really good crystallization speech, and those are so memorable. All right, questions. When they are questioning, they need to ask meaningful questions. So try to teach them that it's not great necessarily just to ask a question just for the sake of asking a question. So don't stand up to ask a question if it doesn't mean anything. Have something that is meaningful, and you get that by listening to the speech, looking for those holes in logic or those evidence holes, or even things that maybe they need to explain why that impacts out the way that they said it impacts out. Or even if that's something that is unique to one side or the other. Teach them to be very professional in the way they ask questions. So occasionally I know that they can get kind of snarky, and I'm not totally opposed to a little bit of snarkiness, um, but they don't need to be so snarky that it becomes unprofessional. The goal is not to make someone feel bad about themselves. So professionalism and kindness goes a long way in getting that higher rank. Make sure the questions that they asked, make sure that they know that the questions they asked need to be unique. So it shouldn't be something that we could ask about any speech. It needs to be something unique to that speech. So really try to get them to hone in on what each individual speaker is saying, so that when they ask the question is very tailored to what they just heard. They need to ask quick questions rather than drawing those out. Be prompt. Ask that question and then let them give an answer. Don't preface. They need to know that, as what that rule means, and that means that you can't go back and say, well, since we know all of this other stuff, what do you think about blah blah blah? They need to ask questions about, and that's also just about asking about that speech. So try to make sure that they understand what that means. Direct questioning. I like direct questioning, and I use it in all of my practices because I think it keeps kids honest when they don't get to say, I didn't understand the question, or they get to kind of bird walk around the question. Direct questioning prevents that from happening. It keeps the arguments honest, and it helps students to really think through the speech that has been given and ask the kinds of questions that will get them to a solid answer. It does need to, if it is used, there has to be precedence kept of the questions, because at that point it's a 30-second period and it is counted as a speech. Also have them not counted as a speech in the precedence, but counted as a speech in that they have to follow precedence in who gets to ask questions when. Teach them the format of direct questioning. So, like I said, try to build up the questions rather than just rapid firing questions that are different. Have the questions try to get to a certain answer, and make sure that the question and the answer that is given is going to be useful. So if it doesn't even matter, why are you even asking? So, that's kind of just a kind of a pet peeve of mine. Like, let's make it meaningful. Let's not just talk just for the sake of talking. We talked about that. All right, answering questions. They need to be clear, concise, and complete in their answer. Encourage them not to ramble, because it uses up time, and it's very frustrating sometimes for the other representatives and sometimes also for the judges. So really teach them to answer concisely, but also completely. When they don't answer completely, sometimes it seems like they're avoiding the question, and that's not a good look. Be professional also in the way you answer. No need to be a jerk. Just answer the question. If the person that asked the question is a little snarky, be the bigger person. Use citations. So use the evidence that they have to cite, where they're getting the information that they're giving in their answer. Reference previous speakers. Make connections to other speeches. And mostly be truthful. If they honestly don't know, tell them to say, I can look that up, but I don't have that answer in front of me. Don't get them in the habit of pretending to know more than they do. It's also not a good look. All right, politicking. So this is what I was talking about earlier as, to me, one of the benefits of congressional debate that students don't get elsewhere. Politicking is good because politicking is a life skill. It's not, I was listening to someone talk about education and kind of the, I guess, the imbalance in education in some communities versus other communities. And one of the things that this person said is it's really not about the teachers or what they learn. It's about the connections that they make. So students who are able to interact with students who are going places, those connections help them later on in their lives. It helps them to move up in their careers because they have developed these networking relationships that can help them, far beyond high school or college. So politicking is important. What that means is learning to work with people, learning to get along with people that normally you might not have been able to get along with. That is a skill, and it should be honed. So teach them to be fair in their politicking. They don't need to be, making deals behind the table, even though in real Congress they do that. But they do need to learn to politic. They need to learn to make friends. It is a social game. And yes, it does matter. As much as we would like to say it doesn't, it does. And I don't think that it's bad that it does, because that's a life skill. This event is designed to help develop it. Be communicative. What do you want? Why do you want it? Stay in the loop by going outside of your comfort zone. Go talk to people that you would not normally go up and talk to. Learn to extend your hand and shake hands if we can ever do that again. Go to the Facebook groups. Go to the off-time meetings. Have lunch with people that you don't normally interact with. Those are all things that people do in real life to develop their careers. Congress is no exception. Nonverbals. So it starts when you get to the tournament. And I always told the kids, don't go in the cafeteria and act like a juvenile delinquent, because people see you and you make an impression the very second you get there. You don't go talking about other kids. You don't go talking about judges. You are professional from the second you walk in the door. So that's important. That is part of the nonverbal. Own your participation. When you walk to the front, give your name, say it loud and proud, and give your information. Even if you feel uncomfortable, you don't want anyone to know that you're uncomfortable. So it's kind of a fake it till you make it thing. they need to look like they are winners from the second they get in the tournament, but especially when they get to the front of the ring or when they're in round. Even when they're in recess, sometimes it would blow me away listening to the conversations that took place in recess with all the judges sitting right there. And I thought, do you think that I like go deaf during recess? I don't. I hear exactly what you're saying. So teach them that. Teach them professionalism and that they are on the whole time. Facial expressions. Their facial expressions should match what they're saying. So they shouldn't be smiling if they're talking about something that's really sad. They need to, make those things match. They need to learn to gesture without over or under gesturing. How do they hold their legal pad? When do they use their hand? When do they extend their hand forward? When do they put it down? And it's okay to have your hand by your side for a little while. So really work on those things. Work on the transitional movement, going from point 1 to point 2. That movement needs to be smooth and it needs to look natural. So really work on how to step 1 foot forward and move without making it look awkward. The thing I was talking about with preparing speeches in round, I think as a judge, it bothers me because I feel like they're not A, prepared, and B, listening to what's happening. So how can they possibly respond to other arguments if they're not listening because they're too busy writing their own speeches? So have them prep before they get to the tournament, and then have them pay attention throughout the round. Judges watch them. If I'm sitting in the back of the room and the kid in front of me hasn't written anything down about any of the speeches, they've only been writing their own speeches the whole time, that says something to me. Have them, if they have to leave, then, that can't be avoided. But if they leave, it should be very quick. If they, have an emergency and need to go to the bathroom, do that. But they shouldn't be out, chatting with their teammates and that kind of stuff. Teach them that, their job is to be there. And judges notice when you leave and how long you're gone. So really encourage them to wait until recess to leave. Be respectful, but have personality. So let them have a personality. That's an important component of being noticeable. Just don't use that personality to be disrespectful or aggressive. So, but develop a personality. Sometimes they're super nerdy. Use that in their favor. Sometimes they're super funny. Use that in their favor. Each kid is different, so you can't really teach them that there is a right way, but teach them that they can use their own personality to kind of accessorize their speeches. And then appearance is really important. So they need to have their hair done properly. They need to have their clothing neat and ironed and all that kind of stuff. As far as the number of speeches, they should give quality speeches over quantity of speeches. I would rather hear 2 really good speeches than 3 not very good speeches. And sometimes if they give 2 really good ones and then a really bad one, that bad one hurts them more than it helps them. So really talk about quality of the speech. It's better to speak later, like on a different piece of legislation, than it is to rehash an argument. So if they don't have anything on this legislation, tell them just to wait. I would much rather them not speak at all than get up and just say the same old thing that everybody else has already said. Nothing makes me more bored than listening to them beat dead horses. I just don't like it. Crystallize near the end of the cycle, like I've said before. Make sure that everything is rebuttal. So you should be giving arguments that either further the arguments of the side that you're on or go against the side that you're not on. So you should be referencing to some degree those other arguments. Analysis should be deep rather than wide. So it's better to, in debate, you call it parametricize. You want to parametricize your arguments and only talk about a smaller aspect so that you can give a lot more depth of analysis. And that makes the argument much more clear. Rhetorical clarity is good. Rhetorical devices are good. So just work on those through the impromptu speeches and through extent. Really work on how to use rhetoric in your favor. Authorship and sponsorship speeches are good to have. I personally am not one that thinks that is a huge advantage, though. Unless it's later in the round and gives you a speech that you would not normally have gotten, and you can give a really good speech, those speeches tend to be more forgettable because there's not really, they just don't last usually in the minds of a judge. So they're good because they get things started, and sometimes they I'm not saying they're never memorable, but more often than not they are less memorable. So I would rather, if they have one that they truly authored, then yes, give that authorship. But if they're just trying to give all of the sponsorship speeches so that they can have their speeches written in advance, I don't encourage that. And sources, again, sources are mandatory. You have to have something that supports what you're saying, something that lends credibility. Even if it is an argument that kind of is a conclusion drawn from sources and not really saying what the source, like if the source is about one thing that helps you to build a foundation for the argument that you're making, that's great because it's a unique argument. But it's important to have the source, even if the source doesn't say what you're trying to say. It can be just a foundational source, a foundational piece of information that helps you to draw your own conclusion. Don't write the speeches out. I've already said that, and I do think that's super important. And I know a lot of people try to do it for sponsorship, and I get that sometimes with the novice students, that's something that we do to try to help them kind of get acclimated to the event. But sometimes teaching bad habits is bad because they don't learn to break those habits. So I really encourage you not to have them write those speeches and read what they've written. Refutations attack arguments, not speakers, and that just goes with that respect thing. So the format of a speech is going to be intro, which is really short AGV, contextualization if needed, and then point, and a conclusion. So the intro should be about 30 seconds tops. Each point should be about a minute, maybe a minute and 15, but you don't want to continuously go over that 3-minute mark. Really try to teach them to know what 3 minutes feels like so that if their PO messes up, they don't go over or under. So that is something that I always encourage. Be sure they impact, like why does any of this matter? Whatever their argument is, how is that going to change anything? Why does this matter in my decision to pass or fail the legislation? And they should give a call to action in those speeches because they're wanting someone to do something. It's a persuasive speech. Make sure they enunciate, use word economy, that they don't repeat their arguments. I notice sometimes that their point one and their point two are essentially the same thing, just said in a different way. They need to be two different things. And wait for recognition. That's also something that sometimes they get excited and they just can't wait, so they forget to wait for recognition. So those are the things that will help them. Professionalism, being engaged, eye contact, courtesy, initiative, behavior in recess, problem solving in their speeches. Those are the things that will get them noticed. So coaching challenges, personalities. If you have multiple congressional debaters on your squad, they don't always at the get-go get along. Teach them to. That's a skill. We don't always like everybody we encounter, but we are much more successful in our lives if we learn to pretend we like them. So teach them to do that. If they prepare as a group, who uses the prep? If say Johnny and Mary are put into the same room and they prepped these points together, they need to have already talked about who is going to be the person who has first, first use of that prep. So if Johnny doesn't use it, then Mary can. But it will be understood from the beginning that Johnny gets to use these points if they're in the same room. Work on team conflict. Again, that's a skill. And also those moments of conflict, if they're handled right, will really bring your team together. Don't take sides as a coach. Tell them to work it out. Back in the day, parents would say, okay, if you two can't get along, just go fight it out and let's see who wins. Well, sometimes you have to just, as a coach, say, you two go figure it out. I don't have time to deal with your drama. And sometimes they just want you to deal with their drama. And when you don't, the drama goes away. So really, that helps team unity because they have to learn to work through problems, practice together, love each other, encourage each other. We're better when we all do well. We don't want just this kid who's always done well to continue to do well. We want that kid to help all the other kids do well, because if everybody does well, it looks good for the whole team. And keep them honest, and then anything that y'all have issues about, and I will just let that be part of the Q&A. So I'm ready. Hit me with questions.